All right, welcome back to the Magnetism Podcast, guys and girls. This is episode 4. I'm your host, Tuan, the founder of Glow Ups Media, and this is the space where the creator economy, where culture and the psychology of influence all connect and collide. So each week, I riff off of the unseen signals that shape how people show up, from fitness to fashion to brand building, because how someone shows up and what makes someone magnetic isn't just the tactical execution or the strategy. It's in the story, it's in the energy and the presence they carry and they embody in their lives in every given chosen moment. Okay, so today what I wanted to do was start off with something a little bit funny and a little bit amusing. Okay, so I read this article from the New York Post just earlier today, and it basically said that black activewear is daggy now, supposedly because TikTok now deems it outdated, right? Which is kind of interesting. And honestly, first of all, I'll unpack a line which I thought was kind of interesting, right? That they mentioned something along the lines of not TikTok. Black activewear is the millennial uniform of conformity or uniformity or something along those lines, right? So as a millennial, I felt personally, well, two things when I read that first. A little low-key attack, right? Just casually. A little bit amused because 80% of my drawer is black, right? My gym attire are black, my pants are black, my gym tank tops are black, etc., etc. But the the more I sat with it, the more that I realized this isn't just about the clothing or the apparel per se. Okay, it's about identity, our choices, about energy states, and it's about the almost the ongoing generational shift between millennials and Gen Zers, right? Which is something which we'll unpack in this podcast here. Okay, so let's dive into it, right? So for me personally, I sort of asked myself this earlier: why does fashion news even land on me when I don't really care about fabrics, right? Honestly, I have zero clues about fabrics and so on. But what I do see, if we zoom out into the bigger picture, is the energy shift happening at the moment, right? Because once I zoomed out from my own closet, I started noticing a bigger cultural pattern. And it's not really about leggings. It's about how each generation from the millennial to Gen Zers, right, decide to show up and what it says about the psyche and the wiring and the time in which they grew up and how it shows up in their clothing and how they express themselves and so on. Okay. And even if you think back to, we can all think of a time where what you decide to choose to wear, right? Whether it feels like it made you stand out or it made you feel maybe a little bit outdated, right? And so on there. The way I see it between, the way I see the contrast happening between millennials and Gen Z is quite interesting. So I sat and thought about this, but one way I can think about why we make these choices the way we do is that millennials, we default to black, right? Due to the rising of the minimalist culture, right? Where everything we did was out of practicality, out of being efficient, right? Of being survival coded, right? Because millennials defaulted to black because we were survival minimalists, right? We came of age during the global financial crisis. That was 2008. Trying to be taken seriously, trying to adult as a lot of the term seems to be thrown around these days. Buying a lot of versatile basics, right? That works everywhere, right? How can you make something efficient? It's the generation that read Atomic Habits, right? How do we decrease our activation energy, right? To get the most done in the least amount of resource and effort wasted, right? So black was really about practicality, it's about control, and black was uniform, and that is why it sort of become the uniform of millennial culture, so to speak, right? But when you think of Gen Zers, it's a completely different DNA there, right? Completely different wiring. They were born during chaos, during turbulent times, right? They were raised on TikTok, right? They were raised on they were the first generation raised completely online. Okay, so everything is done and everything is tweaked and they are much more sensitive to algorithmic optimizations and shifts in the way that millennials don't. Millennials, we were the first generation that grew up. We were the last generation to grow up completely not on the internet, right? Which is what makes that very subtle but very tectonic shift there. Okay, so for Gen Zers, power comes from play, right? It comes from bold expression, right? So that's where you see it reflected in the activewear sets, okay? That goes beyond just black. You got sage, you got pink, you got brown sets, right? So it's not just fashion, it's an active, almost like rebellion and resistance to the millennial culture there, right? So almost two complete different spectrums there, if you think about it that way. Okay, so it's saying the Gen Z is different DNA there is basically saying we're not here to blend in, right? We're here to be seen, to express ourselves. Okay. So it's not really about, if you really zoom out, it's not really about leggings versus color, so to speak. It's two contrasting paradigms. Yeah, you got survival minimalist versus chaos maximalism, right? And that's why black feels like daggy to them, right? Not because it looks bad or whatever it is, or it's not fashionable, but because it represents the old order, the old operating system. Okay. So if fashion was a mirror, right, then what it basically reflects back upon you, right, is millennials were survival coded and Gen Zers were chaos coded, right? But the real question we got to ask ourselves is what comes after survival and chaos? And that's where Thrival enters the conversation. Okay. And all right, here's the truth, right? And this is what's funny. So when a girl ditches a black set for sage or pastel, she's not thinking along these conscious terms. Like she's not thinking, okay, I'm chaos maximalized right now, right? She's thinking, this makes me feel lighter. This makes me feel more playful. This makes me feel a little bit more fun, a little bit hotter today, right? When a Melbourne girl defends back, she's not quoting or thinking about some generational survival millennial story, right? She's saying, black is chic. This is not changing. I'm not changing. This is me, right? And that's what's going on under the surface there. But that's the thing, right? When what people think and what people do in the moment is micro, but what I'm really interested in is the undercurrent underpinning underneath all of that, okay? Because underneath these choices, that continuum is playing out, yeah? Black has always been this embodiment of control, of discipline, stability. It represents safety. It represents a don't fuck with me and don't mess with me kind of vibe, kind of energy, right? But sage and pink and pastels, right? That's more play, a bit more fun, a little bit more cheeky, a little bit more presence, right? It's about, I'm here, feel me, look at me, right? Millennials are survival coded and Gen Zers is more chaos and expression coded. And this shows up in the choice, right? So black for a while and still very much is, right? To default, right? Start from that. The next move, it's not one or the other, right? It's Thrival. And Thrival is where you're not shrinking yourself, right? You're not shrinking your expression. You're not dressing out of fear, all right? You're not dressing out of the need, the validation to feel seen, right? To dressing out of need for rebellion, right? You're dressing with intention first and foremost, okay? So you choose what amplifies your story, the story that you are trying to tell in that given moment, right? In whatever era, right? That you've chosen to embody, okay? That's what I like. That's why I call it aesthetic intelligence, right? It's the ability to know when to lean into, for instance, black, right? Black discipline, or when to lean into flow. So lean to your sages, right? That's the next evolution of personal magnetism, right? Not about survival, right? And also not just about chaos and rebellion, right? But it's about integration, and that is when you truly thrive. So millennials made black the uniform, which is survival mode, whereas Gen Z has swung in a complete different direction, right, into chaos, into color. But the real move isn't survival or chaos, right? It's thrival. And thrival is about intention, okay? So it's knowing when to be sleek, when to be loud, and letting your vibe choose the color. And one thing that I talked about last week and last week's episode is about soul, right? And how a lot of us yearn for depth in this world, in this day and age, but don't necessarily have the understanding of the ways in which to express or to carry or to really embody those things, right? And so the outfits that we choose to wear is almost shorthand for us to do so without necessarily sometimes having the words or the modalities of expressions to express what our states, right? And the inner states of what we're trying to feel. You can even look at this in terms of fitness, right? Someone's life arc or their transformation arc or their story arc, right? Even when you look at, say, someone's fitness transformation for when they started in the gym and the transformation they go through, why is it that some hits harder when you actually know the reason and the why behind why they do it, right? And that's because the soul is there. And it's very much the same thing with clothes, right? Clothes, also the apparel and everything we choose also carries stories. And when I say stories, not necessarily some big macro hero's arc, hero's journey, cinematic arc all the time, right? But the stories are also down to the micro moments we choose on the day-to-day life, right? Because it's not always about the big grand cinematic arc. It's the little micro stories every day that compound to this big micro chapters and footnotes that build this life that we live, right? So clothes carry story, right? Whether it's you're wearing a black tee or it's a brand new neon set, right? It's a felt state, right? And you feel different when you choose, or even when you decide that, hey, I'm going to put on this white shirt today because it felt comfortable. Even so, right, underneath it, you feel the embodied difference, right? The embodied cognition of wearing the difference there, right? Hope that makes sense. The world is full of attractive people. The world is full of us, who look good, dress well and so on. But really what makes beauty memorable, because a beauty fades, right? What makes it all timeless is the story behind it, because that's infinite. That's what's immortalized, right? And that's something that's sticky. And that's something that people remember long after you're gone. Okay. Let me ask you this as well. Have you ever thought about someone's story in how they carry themselves? They carry themselves very, very differently, right? Someone can look good and we can dress well. We can choose the outfits and look beautiful. But if there's no story underneath the outfit, right, you will feel it. And the person will also feel it, right? You will feel empty, etc. So let me know if this resonates with you. Like, for instance, why do clothes shift your states, Lord? It could just be me overthinking this stuff here, right? And if that's true for people, and it's even more ruthlessly true for brands, and because what you don't use, you lose, including the aesthetic taste, and keeping the pulse and the finger on the people, the marketplace, on culture, and where the conversation is at, right? Look, honestly, I'm not the guy telling you which shade of pink is going to be hot this month, right? That's what our team is for. That's what our network is for. My role is to show you the bigger truths, right? That clothes aren't just fabrics, okay? They're states, all right? And the brands that really get that and they understand that win, right? So tying this back to brands and tying this back to culture and creators, a few considerations and a few questions, a few thoughts on the top of my head as I'm talking here, right? But nano influencers versus traditional influencers. Nano influencers at the moment, I feel, embody these shifts a lot faster than the big influencers. And the reason why is because of the relatability aspect, right? With the everyday, day-to-day girl, okay? They're a lot closer to the culture. And they are a lot more authentic when they play with color and they play with presence. And if you can keep a finger in the pulse as a brand here, you will come close to those truths. The insight from today's New York Post article is also incredibly valuable. If you zoom out and look at it from the perspective of brands and creators, right? If you look at say why the rise of nano influencers, micro influencers is becoming super prevalent, right? In the face of big influencers. They embody these shifts a lot faster, right? This is the on-the-ground social listening. This is the on-the-ground intel, right? For you to, as a brand, understand what's really happening in culture at the moment, right? In the female fitness world, right? They're a lot more closer to culture, how they feel, how they express, and their opinions and choices about the choice of playing with color and presence and meaning underneath it is the valuable intel, right? That would help you shift your campaigns out of just we sell essentially activewear sets, right, to we sell the states, right? And that's a good way of putting it. It's about an emotional state instead of just the fabric. So just to wrap it up, to sum it up again, as a millennial, personally, the trigger to reading that article was I feel a bit attacked, but also amused, and then upon reflection, inspired. Right. Overall, to sum it up, black is not dead, right? But color is calling, okay? And it's not just about the leggings, okay? It's about the story, and it's about the state, and it's about what your clothes whisper to you, okay? These little micro moves that we make and we choose, right, down to the clothes we wear, the colors we wear, right, the style we wear, compounds, right? Even just swapping black for sage could change and just shifts your energy. And I talked about in episode 2 about the psychology of presence. That's the internal conceptual understanding, but the clothing and what we choose to wear, right, and what we choose to accessorize, these are the external primal triggers and switches that allows and shifts you and conditions you, it shifts you into the states that we want to feel, that we want to embody, and we want to express, okay? Just to sum it up, black can be sexy, okay? Black is universal, it is chic. That's never going away. Color can be magnetic, but the real power, the real key is knowing how to switch between the two there. And that's when you really own the room, and knowing how to own the room and the situation at the moment in whatever moment you choose to show up in. So I hope you found this useful and interesting, right? Follow Magnetism podcast to keep riffing with me, okay? And next week, we're going to dive into the next signal. And until then, you have an amazing rest of the week. Take care.